All right, this is episode 3, and this is the first of 3 parts about the New Orleans slave market. And just as the New Orleans port was the most important port in the United States because of the river traffic, as you know, there was no interstate highway in those days. So everything came up and down the river. New Orleans was also the largest and richest slave market in the United States. And it was in the French Quarter. You can go to the site, there's not much to see. But if you look at pictures, which are not photographs, they're drawings, there was a kind of a half a rotunda as a background, and then they had a platform where the slaves came up to be auctioned. And we're going to do in the next episode, episode 4, is we're going to have a reenactment of what it was like to be in the slave market and to be a slave being sold. And we have voice actors that are going to recreate the scene as best we can. I think you'll find they're really talented people that are doing the accents correctly. And I may actually do some of the voices myself. You can hear I have a beautiful voice. That's what they tell me. So the New Orleans slave market existed up until 1861, when the Union troops occupied New Orleans. And for some reason they didn't sell slaves, they didn't believe in slavery. So that was the end of it. But our reenactment is going to be from 1858, before the Civil War, which started in 1861, firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Charleston. The South started the war. So the slave market existed until 1861. It was the busiest one, and it was called being sold down the river if you got sold in New Orleans. And the reason it was feared and hated was because once you became a slave in New Orleans or in Louisiana, you had a very short life expectancy. Not so much in New Orleans. If you were lucky enough to be hired on as a house servant in New Orleans, you had a normal lifespan. But they had really horrible industries that could kill you. For example, if you worked in the cane fields, there were snakes and rats would bite you. You were out in the hot sun all day. You were treated very roughly. Your housing, you may have to sleep outside. Then there was an industry called indigo, which you should be familiar with if you wear blue jeans, which I'm wearing right now. They're dyed with indigo. It's a very special dye. Unfortunately, you can hear a whole episode about indigo in the BBC history series. But very valuable. It was the only thing that they had to dye fabric with. And they grew it around South Carolina and the swampy areas and Georgia. But they also grew it in New Orleans. And then the processing of it used harsh chemicals, and the slaves that were forced to work on it would inhale those noxious chemicals, and it would ruin their lungs. So they only lived for like maybe 5 to 7 years, and they died of horrible lung ailments. So if you hear for example, in the movie Gone with the Wind, they talk about selling people down the river as punishment. If the slaves misbehave, they're going to just take them down the river and sell them in New Orleans. And so in our reenactment, we're going to have a slave driver who actually, chained up these people and brought them down the river. It was a horrible thing. The other thing to know about the slave market is that in 1848, the United States banned the importation of slaves from Africa. So then slavery became a matter of breeding the existing slaves. And so, for example, if you had a young girl, a 15-year-old black woman from Georgia, you could buy her and she could produce children. So a slave was worth about $1,000. And just to give you an idea of how much $1,000 was in those days, if you were a judge, sitting on the bench with your gavel and all that, you made about $2,000 a year. So a slave was worth about half the salary of a year of a judge. They were very valuable. And then the children, if you could produce children with your slaves, they were worth $400 to $600 as children. And then they would grow up and be workers. Often the children were employed in the households because they weren't strong enough to work in the fields and work with indigo. So anyway, that's something to look forward for everyone. The next episode, episode 5, we're going to have a reenactment of the New Orleans slave market. There's a lot more to say about it, and we're going to have 3 episodes devoted to it. So hold on to your hat. Remember, there's going to be over 100 episodes of this podcast. And I may be giving away some of them free at the beginning because if you've listened to podcasts before, the ads are very irritating. But we're going to see, who wants to sponsor us. Hopefully we're going to get sponsors like PBS does, where they just talk about the sponsor at the beginning of the show, and then we get to do the podcast without interruption. So we have big companies like Energy, and we have the New Orleans Tourist Board, and that we're going to hope for sponsors. You can support this show by going to Patreon and taking a subscription. If you pay more than $5 a month, you'll get an ad-free version. We'll give you a code that will allow you to get an ad-free version. We'll have other gifts, and we'll have receptions, parties, and you get to meet some of the historians that we're going to be interviewing on here. There's a famous historian here who is he's a architecture professor, and he talks about all the buildings that exist around New Orleans, different styles. So that's the introduction to the slave market. That's episode 1, and we're going to call it a day for today. And tune in for episode 5, which will have the reenactment of the actual slave market. And we're going to talk to some people that know a lot about the slave market, a lot more than me. Thank you very much for listening.